Hey everyone, welcome back to Hand Tools and Techniques. I'm Bob Rosieski. Glad you could be with me today, because today we're going to start on the legs for our tea table project. So the first thing we need to do is to make a pattern. I start with a piece of 1/4 inch thick straight grain hardwood, and this is just a piece of poplar. And you can use anything you have, plywood would work too. Once we have this approximately to size, I cut this to the length of the leg. And then you can either take the pattern that I included in the design notes PDF, or just use a divider, a square, a straight edge, and a pencil, and go ahead and draw out the leg pattern onto the template stock like I've done here. Then we can go ahead and cut it out. So I'll start by making a few relief cuts down to right around where the pattern line starts, so that when I start sawing down these lines, I have some relief for the waste to fall away. Now I turned the pattern over and I clamped it low in the vise to eliminate as much vibration as I can. And I'm going to use a tenon saw to saw straight down this line, and I'm going to saw just to the outside of the line. Now with the relief cuts in and the straight section sawn, I'm going to use my bow saw, or you can use a coping saw to go ahead and start roughing these out. And now these saws are just like any other saw. You're going to let the saw do the work, let the weight of the saw do the work, don't force it through the cut. The relief cuts are to give us an area where the wood will fall away. As I make my cuts with the bow saw, I try and stay about a 1/16 of an inch or so away from the line. And again, I'm letting the saw do the work, and I try and turn through the cut when I need to turn. And I try and just keep a minimum amount of material exposed above the top of the vise, because this thin material is going to want to vibrate, and that can throw the cut off and induce chatter. Now once it's all sawn out, it may not look real pretty. We did saw wide of the line, but once it's all sawn out, we can go ahead and use our chisel and a cabinet file and go ahead and clean this up and fare it down to the line. So the tools I'm using to smooth out the template are the file and the chisel. And if you have one, you can use the spoke shave as well. And what I'm doing is just faring down to the line that I drew. And if you're going to use the spoke shave, you're going to want to try and cut downhill in order to stay with the grain. Keep an eye on your line and try and leave just a hint of that line behind. Now the spoke shave is going to be great for doing the long, gentle sweeping curves. But when it comes to doing the tighter curves, really you're going to have to do these with the file. And you can also do some bevel down paring with the chisel. Areas like this here, like the back of the knee here, you can actually use a chisel, bevel down, and sort of carve this to a nice smooth curve. Get it as close to the line as you can with that chisel. and then come in with your file and fair that curve, get any faceting out of it. I think it's pretty good, and I've looked at it tonight and worked on it, and the curves feel pretty fair. But what I typically like to do after I create a pattern like this is to walk away from it for a day or two. Maybe I'll go and start the stock prep or something along those lines, and I'm going to come back to this pattern tomorrow, maybe the next day, and I'm going to look at it again, and I'm going to look at the curves, and I'm going to see, do I see any spots that might need to be taken down? Am I happy with the curves? Am I happy with the curve at the top of the foot, at the back of the foot, the back of the knee? Does everything look kosher to me? If after a day or two I can come back and nothing changes and I say this looks great, then fine. Then I can move on and make the legs. But I may find after coming back with fresh eyes that I may want to make a couple minor changes to this, and maybe I see a little hump here or something like that that I want to try and get out and fix that. And I'll do all of that after giving my eyes a break for a couple of days, and then I'll come back and look at it again. So thanks to the magic of modern video, several days have passed since I last looked at the pattern. So I came back into the shop this morning, and I went ahead and took a fresh look at the leg pattern, and I noticed a couple of spots that needed a little bit of refining to the curved areas. So I went ahead and took my spoke shave and my file and refined those areas, and I'm pretty happy with this now. And that's really the benefit of coming back and putting the pattern aside for a day or two and coming back with fresh eyes after letting it sit for a day, is that those areas that may need to be refined a little bit will pretty much become obvious and jump right out at you after you've stepped away from it for a day or two. So that's what I did this morning. And the next step is going to be to go ahead and start preparing the stock for the legs. So I like to start by planing the cupped face first. So what that means is that the outside edges are higher than the middle. This board has a cup across its width, and just about every board that you are ever going to buy is going to have a cupped side. And that's the side that I like to start working on, because the length of this foreplane here, this is a 17-inch plane, I'm going to start by planing across the grain. And what that's going to do is it's only going to remove material from the two outside edges as I start planing across the grain. So that's the length of this plane is then going to start to bring this board to flat. It's going to remove that cup and it's going to bring it flat. And I know that once I get a full length shaving completely across this board, I'm flat across the board's width. Now I'm going to be using a foreplane to start with, and this plane is about 17 inches long, like I said, and it's got a very heavily cambered iron. If you could look down the sole of this plane, you would see that the iron has a radius to it. And this is probably anywhere between, I would say a 32nd to, a thin 1/16 of an inch that I'm going to be taking off with every pass. So, if you thought that hand tool work was slow, I think this process is going to convince you that it doesn't have to be that way. But don't get caught up setting up all your planes to be smoothers, taking sub-thou shavings. If you want to work efficiently with hand tools, thick shavings are your friend. Okay, so as I was saying, there's a planing stop here that the board is butted up against. I've got a hold fast holding a batten so that as I plane across the grain, I'm going to be pushing against this batten, and there's another batten down this other end being held. And I start at the far end, and I'm going to start by planing across the grain to remove that wind. Now, what you might see here with the camera is that I haven't planed the center of this board yet. I'm only removing shavings from the far edge and the near edge, but these are pretty thick shavings. So this edge should work, this face should work down in pretty short order. Okay, now I've switched to a 22-inch long tri-plane, and this plane again has a cambered iron, but it's much less camber than the 4-plane, and it takes a finer shaving than the 4-plane. And I'm now going to plane diagonally and across the grain. Now you might notice that the board is rocking a little bit as I'm planing here. And this is because I'm planing the cupped side, so the bottom side has a hump running down the center of it. If this becomes a problem when I'm planing, what I can commonly do to remedy this problem is to either put shims or wedges underneath the front edge of the board to eliminate the rocking. Okay, so once I have the board close to flat with the trying plane, it's really only taken me a couple minutes to this point, I'm going to use a pair of winding sticks and check the board for wind. Now what you can see is I've set the winding sticks up at opposite ends to each other here. And if we squat down just to take a look, you can see that the board is a little bit higher. The left corner there on the far winding stick is a little bit higher. And the right corner on the near winding stick is a little bit higher. If this board was truly flat, those winding sticks would line up perfectly parallel to each other. But they're not perfectly parallel to each other. This board has a little bit of twist to it. So what I need to do is plane that diagonal until these winding sticks are parallel, and then I'll know that this face is flat and has no wind. So what I'm doing here is taking a few planing strokes from corner to corner to try and eliminate the high spots that are causing the wind in the board. As I plane, you'll see that I will occasionally take a shaving from straight up the edge on one side or the other, just to even out the planing strokes as I go along. But generally what I'm trying to do here is to plane from corner to corner to eliminate wind. So now that I've planed corner to corner, I'm going to recheck with my winding sticks to see how close I am to having that board flat. And I'm going to move the sticks all along the face of the board so that I can check and compare different areas of the board, not just the two ends. And this way I'm sure that the entire face of that board is flat and doesn't have any twist or wind. So the next thing I need to do is start planing the edge of the board to be square and straight and true to the face. So I'm going to start just like I did with the face by using a 4-plane to take down the high spots. And what I'm interested in doing here for the most part is just cleaning up the edge and starting to bring the face into square. But I'm going to finish straightening and flattening that edge and finish squaring it to the face of the board with the tri-plane, just like I did with the face of the board. So after I've got the edge mostly cleaned up with the 4-plane, I'm going to start bringing it into square. So I'm going to take my tri-square and I'm going to check the edge, and then I'm going to use my 4-plane to start removing the high spots and start bringing the edge of that board square to the face. Once I get close, then I will switch out my 4-plane for a tri-plane to start straightening that edge and refining it, bringing it closer to square and closer to flat. So after rechecking a few times, I'm going to make a few final passes. I'm going to check for square one last time, and I'm going to note where I might have any inconsistencies. And here I did notice that there was a little bit of a high spot right along the left edge. That's my left. So I'm going to take a few passes just to take off the high edge there before I check it for square one more time. And we'll see that after I remove the high spots here with a couple of passes of the tri-plane, I'll check it for square one more time, and the board will be square enough for use. Alright, so I've got one face planed, and I've got one edge planed flat and square to this face. So these are now going to become my references. So I want to mark these clearly. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to make a couple of reference marks along these boards because I'm going to be ripping this board into two pieces down its length and then cross-cutting it to make 4 legs blanks. Now this, I know, once this is ripped free and cross-cut, I've already got 2 leg blanks prepared. I only need 2 sides planed flat and square to each other in order to lay out the legs. So my next step is to take this board and mark it so I can rip it in half. So what I'm going to do here, since I know that this distance here is what I need to create my leg, the widest point of my leg, I'm going to set my divider to about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch wider than that dimension. I think that's pretty good. So I'll put the story stick aside. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my divider to transfer this dimension to a marking gauge. And again, a little wider is okay. Just make sure you're at least as wide as your divider. And that looks pretty good. So one of the benefits of this style marking gauge is that I can adjust it and set it with one hand. Little tap, everything gets locked in place. And now I can use my marking gauge to lightly scribe my rip cut. So I'm ripping the board across a pair of sawhorses, and with a board this thick I've struck a line straight down the end grain, and one way that's very helpful for keeping the cut straight is to occasionally flip the board over and saw from the other side. As I'm sawing and I approach the bench, I'll move the bench so that it's further out on the board and so that I am sawing between the 2 saw benches. As I approach the end, I'll do the same thing, moving the saw benches again so that I'm sawing on the far side of the 2 saw benches until I just can't comfortably saw any farther on this side of the far bench. At this point, I'll take the board and I will flip it over and I will saw from the other end. Again, I'm continuing to flip the board over during this whole process to try and keep the cut as plumb as possible. So therefore I'm going to saw from both sides of the board, and I'm going to saw until I meet my previous curve and complete the cut and end up with 2 nice leg blanks. With the board sawn, I follow the same procedure as before, starting with the foreplane to clean up the sawn edge. And after the foreplane, I move on to the triplane to finish straightening, flattening, and squaring that edge to the face. The final step is to check that plane edge for straight and for square. So here I'm using my 4-foot straight edge to check and make sure that the board is straight. Once I confirm that the board is straight, I'll use my tri-square and check it for square. The one thing that I would like to mention is just a brief note on grain direction. When you're making cabriole legs, there's really 2 grain orientations that you're looking for. I like to try and get stock that has what's commonly referred to as rip sawn grain, although it has absolutely nothing to do with how the board was sawn. But basically what we're talking about is diagonal grain, or as close as we can get to diagonal. That's the type of end grain pattern that I'm looking for with growth rings as close to diagonal as we can get when I'm making cabriole legs. And the reason for this is the grain orientation in the final leg. I want that grain to look symmetrical and even no matter which part of the leg we're looking at. And the only way to really get that is with a diagonal grain orientation. Now there are still two different ways that you can orient the grain, even with that diagonal grain. So if we look at a leg here, and let's imagine that this is 3 dimensions for a second, we can have grain, diagonal grain, that is running from the front corner to the back corner of the leg, or we can have diagonal grain that is running side to side. And how you orient that grain in the leg is going to affect what the final leg looks like. If you orient the grain, the grain across the leg from this corner to this corner, then you're going to end up basically with a bullseye pattern. So what you'll see are, as you shape this leg, you'll get rings, concentric rings that'll peak at a bullseye right about at the knee. Some people like this look. It's not my preference. I think it's a little bit too busy for such a graceful, shapely, curved leg. And I think it detracts from the proportions and the shape of the leg. I like to orient the grain in my legs from front corner to back corner. So the growth rings should connect the diagonal line from the front corner of the leg to the inside corner of the leg. What this does is it creates straight grain in the leg on all faces. No matter how you view the leg, you have just straight vertical grain. And I think this really enhances the look of the piece. I think the grain therefore doesn't sort of compete with the shape of the leg. So the simple grain, shapely leg, I think pair well together. So keep that in mind when you're planing your stock and when you're laying out your pattern. So the last thing I'm going to do is to go ahead and lay out the legs before I cross cut them. And the reason that I'm going to do this is because I want to actually add a little bit of length to these legs, because we're going to take the knee block, we're going to cut them long so that we can get the knee block stock out of the leg as well. So what I'm going to do, I like to orient my legs so that the ankle to ankle, basically. So I'm going to start by drawing a line, a square line, on my 2 reference faces, because I want the foot to line up with that square line. And we can cut this off later. It's not really necessary that it be perfectly square to lay out the pattern, as long as you have a good square line. So again, pay attention to your end grain orientation, and I like to lay these out so that my pattern is ankle to ankle. So we're going to lay these on 2 adjacent faces. So I have here a reference face here, and I have a reference face here. So we're going to align the ankles so that they touch on the 2 adjacent sides. So I want to line my pattern up with the square line at the bottom. The ankle should line up with the back of the stock, which we know is flat. And up here, the back of the leg block should line up with the flush with the stock, because we know it's flat. Once we have that, we can go ahead and trace around our pattern. Now, I'm going to turn the stock, flip the pattern, again, because I'm trying to line this up ankle to ankle, and we're going to line it up again on this face. Again, let's make sure everything is flush to the back. We're flush to the back here, even with our square line. We can go ahead and again trace it on this face. The other thing I want to mention again is that we need to leave this leg stock a little bit long. So I'm just gonna, I know that the width of the knee block has to be the same width here. So I'm going to leave a little bit extra, and I'm just going to make it the same width as the knee, square line across, and this is where I'm going to cross cut my stock. So now I can take this pattern again, and I can use that square line as a reference and do the second leg up here. And then later I'll cross cut these the length. So that's basically it for prepping the stock for the legs. I'm going to go ahead and repeat this step on the other four, the top section of this one, and then on the other board, so that I have all four legs. I'm going to go ahead and trace my pattern onto the remaining legs and cross cut these to length on the line that we marked here. And next time we're going to get started cutting the joinery on these before we shape the legs. So the next episode will be laying out and chopping some mortises.